This is a special report from CBS News.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the special report from CBS News. My name is Joshua Leon. We are live from the city of Carlsbad, San Diego District, California, to report to you the unfolding events. We've begun to receive unconfirmed reports of an incoming and unannounced LEQ. For weeks now, AP United States history students nationwide have been bracing for what is currently viewed as the greatest threat to their grades ever since the disastrous DBQ incident from a few weeks prior. For many, this could very well be the breaking point of their grades and perhaps the end of their high school careers themselves.
Currently at Sage Creek High School, one of the many high schools in Carlsbad to be affected by the LEQ should it actually occur. As of right now, you can see it is deserted because of all the students studying in preparation for the LEQ. As of right now, it is not completely confirmed. However,
the emergency alert system has been activated. All radio frequencies and cable televisions have been interrupted and are now broadcasting this message. Please stand by.
Who, what, when, where, why?
The LEQ, short for a long essay question, is part of one of the two subsections of the AP United States History exam due to be taken in early May during any given school year. The LEQ is part of Section 2 of the AP exam and is worth a total of 6 points, subsequently giving a total weight of 15% on the AP exam. The rubric used for grading the LEQ portion is split into 4 sections: the thesis/claim, conceptualization, evidence, and analysis and reasoning, with the first 2 portions being out of 1 point each and the last 2 portions being out 2 points each. In order to receive full point possible for the LEQ, all aspects of the rubric must be met and completed correctly. Not following the rubric is a surefire way of receiving a nasty surprise during early July.
Oh my gosh! I got second place!
The thesis portion of the LEQ requires a historically defensible response to the prompt, which establishes the line of reasoning. Note that one must make an actual claim instead of simply restating the prompt. It must be included in either the introduction or the conclusion. For the conceptualization portion, a broader historical context related to the prompt time period must be described in several sentences, i.e. not a word or phrase. The evidence portion is the usage of specific examples relevant to the prompt that support the thesis. This evidence most often comes in the form of key terms such as historical figures, events, or ideas that were from the era. Finally, the analysis and reasoning portion of the LEQ requires a demonstrated usage of historical reasoning as well as complex understanding of such. The second component of analysis and reasoning can and is usually done in the form of a counterargument. There are numerous ways and formats to write an LEQ. However, as long as all rubric requirements are met in a visible manner, a specific format means little. A highly popular format is shown here as an example.
Who, what, when, where, why?
This concludes today's CBS News special report, and we shall proceed with our normal programming. We present to you Period 8, a recap and analysis of America from the year 1945 to 1980.
For much of history, very little has changed. Cultures may change, language, customs, traditions, and religions may rise, modify, or fade away entirely as the sands of time go by. However, one thing has remained a constant: war. War between nations, war between religions, war against anyone different. War for much of history was a catalyst for change. Change in what was often a stagnant and still world order. War dictated the rise of nations and dictated their fall as well. It dictated which people's ideologies and knowledge survived onto the next generation. And for tens of millennia, war has spun the wheels of change and often became the pivotal event of their respective epochs. And then came the Second World War. It was a war of technology, of brutality, and bloodshed, unmatched by even the Great War preceding it. It was a war of imperialism in the East, and one for domination in the West. Its bloodshed seemed nearly endless, until the atomic bomb. In the final stages of the war, the first nuclear weapons were deployed and detonated over the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, thus ending the most destructive conflict known to mankind. But the atomic bomb did more than end just the war. It dictated the fate of the world after.
I love those dear hearts and gentle people who live in my hometown, because those dear hearts and gentle people will never ever let you down.
In the years following the Second World War, America underwent a dramatic transformation in nearly all aspects of its society. Being the only major power in the world to have been left untouched by the destruction of the Second World War, the United States became the preeminent superpower in the world. American banks, companies, manufacturing, and armament suppliers enjoyed a dominance in the international market unseen in the years prior. The American dollar, particularly after the Bretton Woods Conference, became the capitalist world's principal reserve currency, resulting in the creation of two heavily American-influenced global institutions in the form of the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. The stage for such changes were set at the ending stage of the Second World War at Yalta and Potsdam, which were held in February and July to August 1941 respectively, where conferences were held between major Allied powers, and most notably among them being the quote-unquote Big Three. Along with plans such as the fate of the defeated Germany, plans were drafted for the future of Europe as a whole, as well as the establishment of a new post-World War order. Out of Yalta came the United Nations, a successor organization to the ineffective and defunct League of Nations, which sought to promote dialogue between great powers and do what the League failed to do: prevent the next World War. At the same time, however, cracks began to appear in the Allied coalition. At Yalta, the leader of the USSR, General Secretary Joseph Stalin, desired his own sphere of influence in Eastern Europe in the form of Soviet-controlled satellites to serve as a buffer zone to protect from invasions such as the previous Operation Barbarossa, which devastated the USSR. Roosevelt and Churchill agreed under the condition that Stalin would hold quote-unquote free and unfettered elections at a future date. But by Potsdam, now with Truman at the helm rather than Roosevelt, who had passed a few months prior, it was clear that these free and unfettered elections were never going to happen. And as the then British foreign prime minister put it, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. In 1947, the concept of containment came to the minds of geopolitical planners. First suggested by George F. Kennan, containment advocated for the blocking and destabilization of communist ideology and groups around the world by isolating the source of it, the USSR. It was the solution to the danger of the domino effect, which hypothesized that communist ideology could travel similarly to a pathogen, and that should one new nation adopt as an ideology, the rest of the regions would follow, falling like dominoes. This became the forefront of American foreign policy, and became the rationale for many further international actions throughout the decades. By 1949, the policy of containment took a new form, this time in the form of the first American peacetime military alliance, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to counter the growing Soviet influence in Europe. Internally, American society was beginning to be affected by many of the international developments going on at the same time. President Truman developed and operated under a policy that historians now term as Cold War liberalism, which described the Truman administration policy of the continuation and adaptation of many of the New Deal's programs, along with the various foreign policies which exemplify the containment proposition to counter rising Soviet influence. Cold War liberalism reached its height with Truman's proposed fair deal in 1949, which sought to greatly increase and expand the American welfare state as a whole. Much of this fair deal, however, was never been able to enact it, as fears of socialist policy made much of the American public adverse to to many of the social programs and welfare state policies of the Fair Deal included. By the end of 1949, a culture of fear and paranoia had gripped the American public, a fear only accentuated by the first Soviet atomic bomb detonation, elevating the budding Cold War to a terrifying new reality.
Bomb, 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 dang, 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 ding, dong, ding, blue moon, 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 blue moon, dip, 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 moon, 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 blue moon, dip, 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 moon, 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 blue moon, dip, 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 bomb, 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 dang, 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 ding, dong, ding, blue moon.
Oftentimes, when presented with the notion of the 1950s, the image of American wealth, prosperity, and general welfare comes to mind, oftentimes presenting America during the 1950s as the American quote-unquote golden age. Though this image has been indeed one of the heavy romanticizations alongside similar concepts, which is the notion of the quote-unquote American dream, this image was still true to an extent. Similarly, in the late 1940s, which preceded the years prior, the 1950s were characterized by a surging economy and generally prospering living conditions across American society. Chief among the many developments of the era was the growth of American consumer culture. Although consumerism as a concept and a social trend did exist before the 1950s decade, consumerism as it is seen today only truly developed during the 1950s post-war era. Products such as the television, cars, oven, refrigerators, and a much vaster range of items were unprecedented in their terms of availability and scale compared to the years before. Manufacturers of these products were also incentivized to ensure the cycle of consumption continued, often utilizing planned obsolescence to encourage customers to purchase new and better products every few years. Shopping malls, fast food restaurants were also introduced to even further this trend of consumerism. What made the wide proliferation of consumerism in American society possible, however, was the introduction of the television. A sharp contrast to the mere 7,000 television sets in 1947, the 1950 statistic of roughly 7.3 million television sets in America created a new medium for companies to advertise to the consumer, forever changing the way products were sold to the American populace. The image of the golden American society did not originate from consumerism alone, of course, rather it was a combination of the prior as well as a variety of many other aspects. One such aspect were the various American social programs. Unlike consumerism, which provided wealth and comfort, these social programs sought to provide security and safety. The GI Bill, passed in the late stages of the Second World War, was one such aspect, which provided a wide range of benefits for veterans after their service, particularly in the field of education. The Veterans Administration also sought to help former soldiers fully utilize the GI Bill, this time in the field of housing. Eisenhower's 1958 National Defense Education Act only furthered the cause set by these programs, providing millions of dollars worth of funds to colleges and universities in the scientific and technological sectors. The working conditions and job security of the era appeared to be beneficial to the American workers throughout the nation. The relationship with the collective bargaining between labor force and management enabled many workers to experience much better treatment and determination of raises far better than what workers had in the years prior. A partnership between essentially all American industries and with unions made it so that increased wages, pension plans, as well as health insurance no longer were unreachable goals. Rather, they were to be expected parts of the American workforce. The general increase in living standards, though not the direct cause, greatly facilitated the baby boom phenomenon which occurred during the era. So-called miracle drugs such as penicillin and other antibiotics enabled a much larger lifespan through the changing of how various illnesses and diseases were treated. The effects of these various developments within American society showed, with birth rate spiking during the post-war era, with an average of 3.2 children in every family being present in 1950, much higher than the years preceding and succeeding it. As a result of the Veterans Administration and the Federal Housing Administration, a housing boom occurred alongside the baby boom. William J. Levitt created the Levittown, which combined with the wide proliferation of automobiles and the various highway projects under the National Interstate and Defense Highway Act of 1958, created the image of American suburbs that was so prevalent in the American Golden Age. Internationally, the 1950s were highly tumultuous. Starting the first year of the decade, war broke out in Korea, where North Korea invaded the South in an effort to consolidate the Korean Peninsula under a singular communist government. Long story short, a primarily American UN peacekeeping force under General Douglas MacArthur was sent to Korea to repel the invasion. They managed to reach the Yala River until a massive China counterattack forced them to retreat. After a rather heated argument involving MacArthur and the possibility of a nuclear weapons deployment, the general was fired by Truman for insubordination. Eventually, the war reached a stalemate, and due to the loss of public support, the war ended with a ceasefire and the borders were reset alongside the original border at the 30th parallel. The Korean War was one of many examples of the containment philosophy put into action, being the first among many. The growing involvement of the United States in international affairs in a way signaled the growing shift in world power, whether that be military, political, economic, onto new players on the world stage. In this case, from the hands of European great powers such as Britain and France to that of superpowers such as the United States and the Soviet Union. By the time Eisenhower became president in 1952, the policy of isolationism of the decade prior was all but abandoned, opting for a quote-unquote new look, a foreign policy which sought to counterbalance growing Soviet expansionism and influence, with anti-communist actions on the part of the US taking place worldwide. Despite the image presented by many modern depictions of the American 1950s, the so-called American Golden Age was not always what it purported to be. For one, the reality of the American dream was something only experienced by few. The American suburbia that was so ubiquitous in the 1950s was a way of living only exclusively for middle-class young whites. Oftentimes, non-white races such as blacks, Asians, and at times Jews were completely barred from living in these regions, forcing these individuals to reside in only the cities. These cities, add insult to injury, were not in great shape either, as a whole. During the 1950s, while the whites left the cities in droves and headed towards the suburbs, non-whites entered the cities in even greater numbers. This growth in population is normally fine, and at times even looked at favorable. However, this only applies if a readily available job market is present. By the 1950s, the various cities located in the industrial Northeast and Midwest downsized the manufacturing sector due to no longer requiring the need for such industrial capability. The result was an overall rise in urban poverty, unemployment, and slums, as well as a general decline in quality of life in many cities. John Kenneth Galbraith's 1958 book, The Affluent Society, sums this situation up well, saying that the poor were a mere quote-unquote afterthought in the minds of politicians. 1950s culture is another aspect of American society that is frequently misunderstood. American culture, contrary to the various return to tradition memes, was a rather two-faced phenomenon. On one side, there was a conservative and traditional version of American culture. This, of course, is a more popular interpretation of the 1950s and is more of an umbrella term for the combination of the various conservative elements of American culture, such as traditional gender roles, the nuclear family unit, and American religious values, the latter of which became highly influential to the point where the phrase "under God" was added to the Pledge of Allegiance in 1954, and "In God We Trust" to the American currency in 1956. In essence, the traditionalist side of 1950s American culture was one that promoted conformity to the norm. In sharp contrast, the other side of American culture during the 1950s was one of rebelliousness and breaking away from the norm, which was so heavily conformed to at the time. One of the most variations in culture could be seen in its music. In the more traditional side of American culture, music was primarily influenced by the swing jazz of the past decade, with a heavier emphasis on the singers themselves rather than the band. Take Bing Crosby and Bob Hope and their movie The Road to Hong Kong for an example.
When two guys pull together, it's teamwork. In foul or sunny weather, it's teamwork. What does it take to make any business climb? You'll find it takes teamwork every time. Incidentally, your jokes will kill the yoke, 'cause it's teamwork. I love your hokey vocals, it's teamwork.
On the counterculture side, music differed in the sense that it derived from African American rhythm and blues, creating a new form of music called rock and roll. Take Chuck Berry's Johnny B. Good for an example.
Go,
The 1950s era, despite the image of peace and prosperity, was also one of rampant fear and paranoia. This fear quickly arose as a result of the first successful Soviet nuclear weapons test in 1949, leading to many to be suspicious as to how the USSR obtained this technology in the first place. The first countermeasures originated in the 1940s in the form of the House of Un-American Activities Committee and the Loyalty Security Program. However, fear faded after a while due to a lack of concrete evidence. It was not until February 1950 that Joseph McCarthy accused the Senate Department of being run by communist saboteurs. What resulted was a 4-year-long reign of McCarthyism, where the senator accused politicians, departments, and other individuals of subversive activity, oftentimes with little evidence. These evidence were often sensationalized by the media and only served to further the public suspicion of communist agents working in the nation. Eventually, this reign came to an end after McCarthy began investigating the army and then promptly got removed, later dying of an alcohol addiction 3 years later.
With a new explanation, people in motion, people in motion, for those who come to San Francisco, be sure to wear some flowers in your hair.
The 1960s in America were a rather eventful decade. In the first year, John F. Kennedy was elected to the presidency, becoming one of the youngest men elected to office. His approach and tactics were highly different from the presidents preceding him, as his approach utilized charisma and personality rather than platforms or issues. His presidential running was also unique in the sense that it utilized television as a viable method for reaching out to voters. Interestingly enough, those who listened to the radio stated that Nixon, JFK's opponent, was the winner, whereas it was the opposite for television viewers. Internationally, the foreign policy of the decade was more or less the same to the one preceding it. However, developments abroad made pursuit of these brinkmanship policies rather risky. In Cuba, the pro-West government, led by the dictator Fulgencio Batista, was overthrown by the Soviet-backed revolution, led by Fidel Castro in 1959. Nikita Khrushchev, who would replace Stalin after his death in early 1950, had announced only a few years prior that the USSR would fund efforts to support wars of natural liberation internationally. JFK, in an effort to keep Soviet influence out of the Western Hemisphere, implemented various countermeasures, primarily using the CIA in an effort to destabilize the Cuban government, such as assassination attempts on Fidel Castro himself. Essentially, all of these measures failed, the most spectacularly being the failed 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion, in which all invading mercenaries or CIA-backed insurgents were basically killed by Cuban government forces. By 1961, American-Soviet relations were breaking down once again as a result of the brinkmanship policy that both sides pursued, particularly after the erection of the Berlin Wall. Tensions reached a peak in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the United States and the USSR were held in a nuclear standoff after the U.S. placed Cuba under a blockade upon discovering Soviet missiles being based there. After an extremely contentious week and on the day before the U.S. planned to invade Cuba, the leaders of both the USSR and the U.S. came to an agreement to defuse the situation, where the Soviets moved their missiles out of the island and the U.S. promised to invade Cuba, as well as a secretive or less well-known clause that the U.S. would remove their own missiles located in Turkey. From that point onward, the brinkmanship foreign policies of both respective nations would soon drop for a limited state of detente or a peaceful competition and coexistence between the two nations. On November 22, 1963, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas by Lee Harvey Oswald. Kennedy's presidency, particularly domestic policy record, was neither one of significance nor of true change. However, his image of a charismatic and charming young leader, combined with his untimely death at the hand of an assassin, contributed to the legend of JFK, and that Americans were, in a sense, robbed of a great and promising leader. After JFK's assassination, he was replaced by his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson. LBJ was a vastly different individual compared to his predecessor. He did not have the personality nor the charisma which raised the LBJ to political power. However, LBJ had what JFK did not, a fully conceptualized platform of policy. It was termed the Great Society, and was LBJ's initiative to end poverty in our time. Using his ability as a skilled negotiator, LBJ forwarded his initiative and established many agencies which would bring the nation closer to its goal. The Office of Economic Opportunity, established by by the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964, established numerous programs to empower the American people with working opportunities and sought to assist the community. Medicaid and Medicare, alongside education-based acts such as the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and Higher Education Act, all sought to address poverty at its roots, and in a way were the reincarnation of the New Deal programs of the 1940s under FDR. The Great Society Initiative is widely regarded to be a mixed success, particularly due to its inability to address the basic problems of American society. Despite this, the Great Society as a whole benefited Americans during the time to a great degree. As for foreign policy, LBJ's legacy was much more mixed. Despite the pursuit of détente between superpowers, the United States still followed this containment policy to an extent, something most visibly seen in Vietnam. Since Eisenhower, American interests in Vietnam were extensive to the containment principle. American direct involvement, however, was limited still, just usually being military and economic aid to the American-backed regime in South Vietnam, which was essentially the proxy used against the North Vietnamese, the proxy of the Soviets at the time. This changed with LBJ's presidency, where the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where American warships were supposedly attacked on multiple occasions by North Vietnamese torpedo boats, prompted the U.S. Congress to grant new powers to LBJ, primarily ones that included more control over American military assets in Vietnam. By 1965, LBJ began deployment of American forces on the ground in Vietnam, as well as commencing Operation Rolling Thunder, a bombing campaign that saw an amount of explosive ordnance dropped not seen since the Second World War. Initially, the war was seen as an easy victory for the United States military. However, as political goals of the United States government began to override the military strategies and logistics, the prospects of an easy victory began to fade out of sight. By the late 1960s, American journalists began to catch on something was wrong and not quite right with the progress of the American military. Eventually, as images of killed soldiers and killed civilians, as well as the lack of any actual progress in degrading the enemy, in the form of the news of the Southern Tet Offensive having reached the American people, the American government lost much of its credibility, causing a wave of protest from a plethora of activist groups nationwide, leading to further strife both externally and internally for years to come. American culture was not exempt from the division that much of the 1960s era was characterized by, and perhaps in some ways a better exemplar than others. At the start of the decade, the youth began to become much more involved in American society as a whole. Influenced on part of the rebels of the 1950s, the American youth, such as those who made a student for a democratic society, founded their own movement on the basis of the rejection of rampant consumer culture, as well as for American foreign policy and cultural ideology as a whole, as outlined in the Manifesto of the Port Huron Statement. These youth activists would often be pivotal in many key events throughout the decade, most notably during the many anti-war protests of the era. This youth activism was in fact a subset of a much larger movement known as the counterculture, where the hippie ideal placed emphasis on the liberation of traditional social structures, a movement that remained heavily prevalent throughout the decade and had lasting effects on the ones that followed. What was likely the most far-reaching development of the decade, however, was the civil rights movement. The idea of such a movement to conduct social activism for the rights and equality of African Americans was not new. The preceding decades had both their respective movements, such as the Double B movement, the Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porters, the Congress of Racial Equality for the 1940s, along with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and Montgomery bus boycotts in the 1950s. The respective movements that occurred during these decades were neither actually the true representative parts of the civil rights movement as a whole, rather they developed the condition in which the civil rights movement that's most well known today could develop into. Throughout the early 1960s, smaller sub-movements existed, such as the Green Board sit-ins, sponsored by the Students' Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, as well as the Freedom Ride, which were organized by the Congress of Racial Equality. In both cases, the value and effectiveness of nonviolent protests were discovered by many of the activists, and most notably Martin Luther King Jr., the eventual unofficial face of the movement. These lessons were later applied to the Birmingham protests, from which a famous letter for Birmingham jail was written. From these events came the attention of both the American public and the government. The American public was appalled at the harsh treatment at the hands of the Birmingham City Administration, whereas Kennedy went on television to promise major legislation to address the glaring issue of discrimination. The later 1963 March in Washington, in which Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous I Have a Dream speech, symbolized the peak of the civil rights movement. Images of both blacks and whites marching in solidarity for a common cause demonstrated an image of national unity in support of civil rights. Eventually, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were passed, a victory hard fought by the activists. This national unity, however, did not stay for long. The reactionary movement from white supremacist groups began attacking black people and organizations at levels unseen for decades. Additionally, a more confrontational, aggressive form of activism arose in the form of black nationalist organizations such as the Black Panther Party and Nation of Islam, coming from splinters of the civil rights movement. It was led by those who realized that protests and legislation were meaningless if the white people in power did not change the poverty and inequality that were so prevalent in black communities. Then on 6:01 p.m., April 4th, 1968, at the Lorraine Motel, Memphis, Tennessee, Martin Luther King was assassinated while he was giving a speech to support local workers. His death marked the end of unity seen the years prior and signaled the beginning of strife and racial conflict which plagued the nation in the years and decades that followed.
A large misconception surrounding this era was the supposed uniform political spectrum. Many often believed the 60s was primarily the hippie era of a mainstream liberal and progressive movement. While it is true that liberalism was an extremely high influence during this time period, it was not the only progressive side that was highly influential. Indeed, there is an extremely strong liberal influence. However, there is also a powerful conservative movement going on at the same time, primarily under the Young Americans for Freedom banner. These individuals outlined their principles in the Sharon Statement in 1960, where they defended the free market and supported the Vietnam War. Their primary concern, however, was a too powerful national government that would use said powers in an oppressive manner. These concerns would later transfer to the next generation of young conservatives, most notably during the 1980s Reagan administration. A rather decent portion of the 1970s era was dealing with the fallout of the previous epoch. When Nixon was elected as president in 1969, he, unlike his predecessors, sought and vowed an exit from Vietnam. Nixon, however, wished for peace with honor, or the withdrawal without humiliation that usually comes along with it. As such, he adopted a policy called Vietnamization, where the American soldiers were greatly reduced to a mere fraction of the original number, being at less than 24,000 by 1973, compared to the peak of 543,000 in 1968. This did little to alleviate internal divisions. However, as protests in the anti-war movement intensified even further throughout the 1970s, particularly after the killing of 4 students and wounding of 11 others after an incident involving panicky National Guardsmen. The optics surrounding the Vietnam War only became worse after journalist Seymour Hersh exposed the My Lai massacre incident, where hundreds of villagers were killed en masse in the My Lai region. This incident only intensified calls for the war to be resolved, particularly after a lackluster verdict that determined a single second lieutenant as the sole perpetrator responsible. By 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed jointly by the United States and North Vietnam, were a pullout of American forces in exchange for their safety. In 1975, with essentially all aid cut from South Vietnam, North Vietnam launched a final offensive, and Saigon fell. With the end of the war, 58,000 American soldiers were killed, over 300,000 were injured, and countless others were given irreparable trauma from a war that barely changed the geopolitical landscape of the area. The fall of Saigon was perhaps one of the greatest humiliations that the United States faced in history. Much better success, however, was found by the U.S. on the wider international stage. The limited status of detente between America and other opposing nations became increasingly more so during the 1970s. Following advice from National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, Nixon sought to establish a peaceful relationship and coexistence between the U.S. and other communist nations. Nixon first traveled to the Soviet Union to meet with his Soviet counterpart, General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev, where he signed the first Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty to regulate nuclear arrangements. He also traveled to China a year later in 1972 and became the first president to do so. There, he sought to establish formal diplomatic relations with the nation. His visit was considered rather successful.
Today, the president walks among priceless treasures from China's golden age. Among them, a pair of ear stoppers used by the emperor to keep from hearing criticism.
Put the stopper into his ears so that he couldn't hear the criticism.
Give me a pair.
His success internationally, combined with the chaos in the Democratic Party and an economic upturn, set up Nixon to have a substantial and decisive advantage over his opponents. Additionally, his candidacy appealed to the silent majority of America, who were moderate independents who sought peace and order, something that many found Nixon to be able to provide. As such, Nixon's re-election victory over his opponent George McGovern did not come as a surprise to many, winning 61% of the popular vote and winning every state except Massachusetts and D.C. This success, however, was short-lived. June 1972, 5 men were arrested for a break-in incident at the Democratic National Committee at the Watergate complex in D.C. in May 1973. A Senate investigation committee was formed and began to hold televised hearings. In these hearings, the testifiers implicated Nixon in the plot to cover up the incident, implying a much larger role of the part of Nixon. June 1974, the House Judiciary Committee voted to activate several articles of impeachment against Nixon. However, before they could proceed, Nixon resigned from office, becoming the first president to do so. He then placed Vice President Gerald R. Ford in his place, but a month later pardoned Nixon. International and national politics aside, the 1970s had another development that defined the decade: the environment and resource crisis. Since the beginning of the 1970s, the U.S., though originally the world's leading producer of oil, had become highly reliant on oil from the Middle East. This reliance on the Middle East for oil became a detriment to the nation. Recent conflicts with Israel and other Arab states, many of which were a part of OPEC, left many bitter, particularly after American assistance helped Israel win in the conflicts these Arab states lost. As a result, OPEC declared an oil embargo in October 1973. This causes an energy crisis in America, where oil suddenly becomes short in supply. This lack of oil, combined with other long-term economic problems, caused the American economy to slump and begin to experience a combination of extreme inflation and economic stagnation, termed stagflation. Throughout the 1970s, 3 different presidents attempted to solve this economic crisis. None of them succeeded. Nixon attempted to solve this crisis through price-wage controls alongside the removal of the gold standard, but failed. Gerald Ford attempted to implement a whip inflation now, or win, campaign. It was more of a social program than anything, and though well-intentioned, it was highly unpopular. Then comes Jimmy Carter. He was a candidate who was originally very popular, defeating Ford with a 50% popular vote. Running on a platform to restore morality to the White House, he lacked the proper experience to actually carry out his plans. Being an economic conservative, he utilized deregulation tactics in various industries in an effort to stimulate competition and cut prices. Rather than the stimulated competition and cut prices Carter expected, a phenomenon known as deindustrialization began to occur, where industrial regions were stripped of their infrastructure, and as a direct result of corporations attempting to cut costs. The steel industry was perhaps the hardest hit, creating an entire region of the United States aptly termed the Rust Belt. As a result, rather than helping, Carter's economic measures ended up harming a very large chunk of Americans, making him deeply unpopular. The final nail into the coffin was that Carter's political career was the Iranian Revolution and the hostage crisis, which caused both a loss of political face and an economic downturn due to gas price jumps, setting up his future loss in the 1980 election. The energy crisis also had the effect of people coming to the realization that the world's natural resources were not infinite. The concept of environmentalism was not new, even at the time, with it existing to an extent nearly 50 years prior. The 1962 release of Silent Spring by biologist Rachel Carson provided a haunting analysis on the effects of human activity on the environment. warning of a spring where no birds sing. At the start of the decade, a new approach to environmentalism occurred, where Americans celebrated the first Earth Day, as well as the passing of the National Environmental Policy Act, which created the Environmental Protection Agency, an agency meant to protect the environment from unnecessary damage from human activities. A rather large misconception about the 1970s decade was that the Watergate scandal greatly damaged the reputation of the Republican Party. This is an easy assumption to make. Spying, collusion, and the rest of the illicit activities done in part by the Nixon administration would not have been taken kindly by many individuals in normal circumstances. However, when the truth of the Watergate scandal came out along with Nixon's subsequent resignation, there was a very limited reaction from the public. Politically, several reforms were passed as a countermeasure to a future similar event. However, in terms of the American public themselves, voter apathy emerged rather than pushback. Moreover, the Republican Party instead became increasingly more conservative over time.
Sherry, Sherry lady, going through emotion. Love is where you find it. Listen to your heart. Sherry, Sherry lady, living in devotion. It's always like the first time. Let me take a part. Sherry, Sherry lady, life is not tomorrow. Take my heart and lose it. Listen to your heart. Sherry, Sherry lady, to know you is to love you.
As the 1970s came to a close, America had taken on a form that rendered it unrecognizable from America in the past years, for better or worse. Gone were the ideals of conformity and traditional values. Now there was rebelliousness and counterculture. Gone were the days of normalized discrimination and prejudice. Now there were civil rights and the semblance of true equality. Gone were times of total prosperity. Now there was economic and environmental strife. By the 1980s, America had reached a divergence point. One between the ideals of the past and traditionalism versus the ideals of the future and progressivism. Ronald Reagan's election solidified a move to the former, forever changing the culture and political landscape of America. By this decade, the state of the Cold War had reached a new reality. The USSR is suffering from the effects of decades of stagnation and mismanagement from Brezhnev and an inefficient Politburo. Began to look west for the answer to their troubles. By 1984, a promising young politician of the name of Mikhail Gorbachev took power and began implementing liberalization reforms. Soon came Glasnost, then Perestroika, the lifting of the Iron Curtain, and then the end of the Cold War, and beyond.